There existed a particular kind of pain reserved for those who had given everything only to watch history rewrite their sacrifice as non-existence, who had bled for causes that officially never required their blood, who had saved lives that the world pretended had never been in danger in the first place. For Isra Ashfall, this pain had become companion more faithful than memory, presence more constant than hope during years spent learning to make herself small enough that others might forget she had ever possessed the audacity to matter in ways that challenged comfortable narratives about heroism and appropriate recognition. At 28, she carried scars that told stories no historian would ever record, marks that served as personal testament to night when palace walls had run red with rebellion, and she had chosen protection over survival, chosen to shield royal blood with her own body, while assassins carved through corridors that should have provided sanctuary, but had become maze of death where loyalty was Mia's. You're not through proclamation, but through willingness to die anonymously for causes that would never acknowledge such sacrifice. The official account spoke of thwarted coup attempt that had been contained through swift action by royal guards and loyal nobles, diplomatic language that transformed systematic slaughter into managed political crisis, while erasing evidence of common-born individuals whose intervention had saved throne through methods too messy for royal dignity to acknowledge or commemorate in ways that might complicate carefully constructed narratives about appropriate sources of protection and legitimate authority. But memory possessed stubborn persistence that resisted official revision, carrying truth through years of systematic forgetting that had been necessary for political stability and social order, that required clear distinctions between those whose sacrifice deserved recognition and those whose contribution needed to remain invisible for the comfort of hierarchies that depended on maintaining a priate distance between royal bloodline and common protection that might suggest uncomfortable dependencies. Isera had learned to live with invisibility that extended beyond simple oversight to encompass deliberate erasure, existence that had been reduced to whatever others were willing to acknowledge, when her presence became unavoidable for practical reasons, while her history remained carefully excluded from conversations about events that had shaped current political arrangements through methods that required careful management of truth. The summons that brought her back to Palace after 5 years of systematic absence carried weight of command that brooked no refusal, despite her understanding that return meant confrontation with spaces that held memories too dangerous for comfortable official narratives, witnesses to events that had been transformed from desperate struggle into managed political crisis through careful application, and of diplomatic language and selective commemoration. She had spent those years in voluntary exile that served multiple purposes, allowing palace administration to function without uncomfortable reminders of sacrifices that challenged official accounts, while providing her with opportunity to process trauma that had been shaped not just by violence endured but by erasure that followed, systematic removal of recognition that transformed heroism into inconvenience. But children possessed different relationship with truth than adults whose perspectives had been shaped by political necessities and social expectations about appropriate acknowledgement of contribution. Young minds operated according to simpler mathematics that calculated worth through impact rather than status, recognition through effect rather than official documentation that might complicate comfortable arrangements about credit and responsibility. Prince Kieran Blackthorne, heir to ultimate authority throughout territories that spanned continents, had been 7 years old when rebels had breached palace security with violence that threatened every member of royal family, according to plans that viewed bloodline elimination as necessary foundation for political transformation, that would serve different vision of appropriate governance and so cool. Isle organization. At 12 now, his memories of that night remained unfiltered by diplomatic revision that had transformed desperate struggle into managed crisis, carrying details that adults had learned to forget or reframe according to official narratives that served current political stability over historical accuracy, about events that had challenged every assumption about palace security and appropriate protection for those who served hereditary authority. The throne room where her judgment would occur represented convergence of political power and social hierarchy, where decisions were made that affected millions of lives, according to principles that balanced immediate necessity with long-term stability, while its grand architecture spoke of permanence that transcended individual circumstances to encompass institutional authority that honored treaty, tie-in and appropriate recognition of hereditary worth. But for all its impressive design and ceremonial significance, the space also held memories of night, when such permanence had proven illusory, when institutional authority had required protection from common-born individuals whose sacrifice had preserved systems that officially needed no such salvation from sources that challenged comfortable assumptions about appropriate relationships between authorship and protection. Tapestries that depicted historical victories and royal achievements provided visual reminder of official narrative about appropriate sources of strength and legitimate basis for authority, while their careful curation suggested understanding that history required management to serve present purposes, rather than simple documentation of events that might complicate current political arrangements through inconvenient details about dependency and sacrifice. Tonight, those carefully constructed narratives would face test from source that possessed different relationship with truth, different standards for evaluating worth, different priorities about recognition that operated beyond political convenience to honor impact, that transcended official documentation or comfortable social expectations about appropriate credit for protection, that had preserved lives in institutions. The Omega who had learned to disappear would discover whether invisibility that had protected her from uncomfortable questions might prove inadequate when confronted by memory that refused diplomatic revision, recognition that honored truth over convenience, acknowledgement that some bonds transcended political necessity to serve purposes deeper than official narrative could encompass or control. Palace walls that had witnessed sacrifice would echo once again with truth that challenged every comfortable assumption about heroism and appropriate recognition, while young voice would speak certainties that adults had learned to qualify according to social expectations and political necessities that prioritized stability over accuracy about events that had shaped current arrangements through methods too complex for simple commemoration. The reckoning had been delayed but never avoided, carrying forward through years of careful forgetting until moment when truth could no longer be contained by diplomatic language, or managed through selective acknowledgement that honored some sacrifice while erasing others, according to calculations that served present comfort over historical accuracy, about dependency and debt. Some debts accumulated interest during years of non-payment, growing larger rather than disappearing through systematic neglect, demanding recognition that transcended political convenience to honor impact that had preserved lives and institutions through methods that challenged comfortable narratives about appropriate sources of strength and legitimate protection for authority that depended on willing sacrifice from those whose contribution required careful management to maintain hierarchies that defined social order. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The iron shackles around Isera's wrists served more as symbol of her reduced status than practical restraint, cold metal that marked transition from voluntary exile to compelled appearance before authority that had learned to function without acknowledging her existence during 5 years of systematic absence that had served multiple purposes for political stability and personal survival. The throne hall stretched before her with architectural grandeur, designed to overwhelm individual significance through scale that reduced personal circumstances to insignificance when measured against institutional authority and hereditary power. Guards flanked her progress down marble corridor, where footsteps echoed with sounds that announced arrival of someone whose presence had been carefully excluded from palace operations, since circumstances had made her continued visibility problematic for official narratives about appropriate protection and legitimate sources of strength that preserved royal authority through acceptable methods. Her than desperate measures requiring uncomfortable dependency. Isera Ashfall, announced the royal herald, with tone that carried official recognition, while his expression suggested uncertainty about appropriate protocols for someone whose legal status had become ambiguous through years of deliberate administrative oversight that had neither confirmed death nor acknowledged continued existence in ways that might complicate current political arrangements. Summoned before His Majesty, King Aldrich Blackthorn, sovereign ruler of the Eastern Territories, to answer charges of abandonment of sworn duty and unlawful absence from assigned responsibilities that compromised royal security through failure to maintain position within palace guard structure that served protective functions according to established protocols. The formal accusation carried weight of legal authority, while its careful phrasing revealed administrative complexity that arose when official records needed to accommodate individuals whose actual history conflicted with convenient narratives about events that had shaped current political stability through methods that required careful management of truth and recognition. King Aldrich sat upon throne carved from single piece of obsidian that reflected light with dark radiance, suggesting power that operated beyond simple political authority to encompass forces that commanded respect, through demonstration rather than mere hereditary claim, while his presence filled the vast chamber with authority that had been tested through crisis and proven adequate for challenges that exceeded normal royal responsibilities. Beside him stood Prince Kieran, 12 years old, but carrying himself with dignity that suggested understanding of ceremonial requirements, despite youth that typically excused such responsibilities, his position marking preparation for succession that would transfer ultimate authority, according to bloodline that had been preserved through events that officially required no such protection from so. Ursi's beyond acceptable acknowledgement. "Your Majesty," Ysera said with formal courtesy that attempted to balance recognition of royal authority with maintenance of personal dignity that had sustained her through circumstances that had reduced her social value to whatever others were willing to acknowledge, when her presence became unavoidable for practical purposes that transcended comfortable oversight. Around the throne hall, assembled nobles watched with expressions that ranged from curiosity about proceedings that seemed to involve individual whose significance remained unclear, to recognition that suggested partial memory of events that had been carefully managed through diplomatic revision that transformed messy realities into acceptable official accounts. 5 years, King Aldrich observed with tone that mixed official displeasure with something approaching personal hurt, his attention fixed on her face with intensity that suggested evaluation, extending beyond simple administrative matter to encompass questions about loyalty and responsibility that operated beyond formal protocols. 5 years of absence without communication or explanation for abandonment of sworn duties that compromised palace security. "Your Majesty," she replied carefully, though awareness of assembled audience made honest response dangerous when truth about her departure might complicate official narratives that had been constructed to serve current political stability. Circumstances required departure that prioritized long-term security over immediate presence within palace structure. The diplomatic language attempted to acknowledge legitimate concerns about abandonment, while avoiding specifics that might expose administrative decisions that had encouraged her absence through methods that preserved plausible deniability, while serving practical objectives that extended beyond individual preference to encompass institutional requirements. "Circumstances," the king repeated with emphasis, that suggested dissatisfaction, with vague explanations that failed to address questions about accountability and appropriate responsibility for protective duties that had been assumed through formal oath that created obligations beyond personal comfort or convenience. "What circumstances?" he continued with momentum that indicated development toward territory where comfortable evasion would prove inadequate for royal inquiry, that demanded specific answers about decisions that had affected palace security through absence that required explanation, satisfactory for authority that had been personally affected by such abandonment. Could justify abandonment of swore. In protection without formal request for release from obligations that were assumed voluntarily. Around the chamber, noble observers leaned forward with interest in proceedings that seemed to involve questions about loyalty and appropriate service that reflected broader concerns about reliability and commitment among those whose responsibilities included protection of royal authority through methods that required personal sacrifice and unwavering dedication, despite circumstances that might challenge individual comfort. Before she could formulate response that balanced honesty with discretion necessary for maintaining official narratives that served current political arrangements, movement at the throne's base caught her attention, as Prince Kieran stepped forward, with expression that mixed recognition with something approaching wonder. His young face cycled through emotions that suggested internal struggle between certainty and disbelief, while his posture indicated growing excitement about discovery that challenged everything he had been told, about events that had shaped his understanding of protection and appropriate recognition for sacrifice that had preserved his life during circumstances that adults had learned to manage through careful revision. "Dad," he whispered, with voice that carried across chamber despite its quiet delivery, words that commanded attention through intensity rather than volume, while his gaze remained fixed on Ysera's face, with certainty that transcended doubt or diplomatic qualification that might moderate recognition through political considerations. The prince's movement toward edge of raised platform, brought him closer to eye level, that allowed direct assessment of features that had been partially obscured by distance and formal positioning, while his expression suggested comparison between current observation and memories that had been carefully preserved, despite official encouragement to forget details that might complicate comfortable narratives. "Dad," he repeated with greater urgency, as recognition solidified into certainty that challenged everything assembled nobles had been told about events that had been transformed from desperate struggle into managed political crisis through diplomatic language that honored some sacrifice while erasing others, according to administrative convenience. King Aldrich's attention shifted from formal proceedings to his heir, with parental concern that mixed affection with growing awareness that young perspective might introduce complications into judicial matter that had been designed to address administrative issues rather than historical accuracy about events that had been carefully managed through selective acknowledgement. "Kieran," he said gently, though his tone carried undertones of royal authority that suggested preference for maintaining appropriate ceremonial protocol during proceedings that required formal conclusion rather than personal interruption that might compromise dignity necessary for effective exercise of ultimate authority. But the prince ignored diplomatic considerations that would typically govern his behavior during formal ceremonies, his attention remaining entirely focused on woman whose presence had triggered memories that operated beyond political revision, to honor truth that transcended official narratives through personal experience that couldn't be managed through administrative oversight. "That's her," Prince Kieran announced with conviction that carried across Throne Hall with clarity that challenged every assumption about appropriate recognition and historical accuracy, his young voice penetrating silence that had been shaped by years of careful diplomatic management of uncomfortable truths. The declaration hung in ceremonial air that had been designed to honor appropriate authority while maintaining comfortable distance from messy realities that might complicate official narratives about heroism and legitimate sources of protection for royal bloodline that officially required no such salvation from common sources. "That's her," he repeated with certainty that intensified rather than diminished under scrutiny from assembled authority that preferred qualified statements and diplomatic language that preserved flexibility for political considerations rather than absolute declarations that might commit institutions to uncomfortable acknowledgement of dependency and debt. Around the chamber, noble observers exchanged glances that revealed growing comprehension that routine administrative matter had developed complications that extended beyond simple questions about duty and responsibility to encompass historical accuracy, about events that had been transformed into comfortable official accounts through careful management of recognition and appropriate commemoration. But King Aldrich's expression shifted from formal judicial attention to parental concern as he processed his heir's declaration, with growing awareness that young memory might possess different relationship with truth than adults whose perspectives had been shaped by political necessities and administrative requirements that balanced individual circumstances against institutional stability. "Who, Kieran?" he asked with gentle patience that honored parental responsibility while maintaining royal dignity necessary for proceedings that required appropriate conclusion, despite personal complications that might arise from unexpected recognition that challenged official narratives about recent historical events. Prince Kieran's small hand gripped his father's sleeve with intensity that spoke of emotional significance beyond simple identification, while his eyes remained fixed on Sarah's face with certainty that transcended any doubt about accuracy of memories that had been preserved despite official encouragement to accept revised accounts that served political convenience. "The woman who saved me," he said with clarity, that cut through diplomatic atmosphere like blade through silk. Words that transformed administrative hearing into confrontation between official narrative and personal truth that had been waiting 5 years for opportunity to challenge comfortable assumptions about heroism and appropriate recognition for sacrifice that had preserved royal bloodline. The throne hall fell into stunned silence as assembled authority processed declaration that challenged every assumption about events that had been carefully managed through diplomatic revision, while young voice continued to speak certainties that adults had learned to qualify according to political necessities that prioritized current stability over historical accuracy about dependency and debt that remained unacknowledged. During the rebellion, Prince Kieran continued with momentum that indicated he had been waiting years for opportunity to speak truth that had been systematically discouraged through official narratives that honored some sacrifice while erasing others. When the assassins came, she hid me in the secret passage. She sang to keep me quiet when I was scared. She bled to protect me. The memories poured forth with precision that challenged every comfortable assumption about childhood recollection and political revision, details that suggested preservation of truth, that operated beyond administrative management to honor impact that transcended official documentation or convenient social expectations about appropriate credit for protection. Around the chamber, noble expressions revealed growing comprehension that carefully constructed official accounts were being challenged by witness whose perspective had been shaped by personal experience rather than diplomatic necessity, while their discomfort suggested awareness that comfortable narratives might prove inadequate when confronted by truth, that honored dependency they preferred not to acknowledge. King Aldrich's face cycled through emotions as he processed his son's declaration with growing understanding that administrative hearing had become confrontation between official revision and personal memory that possessed different standards for evaluating worth and appropriate recognition for sacrifice that had preserved his heir's life during circumstances that adults had learned to manage through a careful diplomatic language. "She was supposed to be dead," whispered a noble from the assembled court, voice carrying undertones of shock that suggested recognition of implications that extended beyond simple administrative oversight to encompass questions about deliberate deception and systematic erasure that had served political convenience through methods that violated truth and appropriate acknowledgement. "She is supposed to be dead," Prince Kieran replied with certainty that challenged comfortable assumptions about official narratives and appropriate management of historical events, his young voice carrying authority that transcended ceremonial protocol to honor truth that had been waiting for recognition despite administrative preference for convenient revision. The declaration transformed Throne Hall from space designed for comfortable exercise of authority into battlefield where truth and political convenience would determine outcomes that affected not just individual circumstances, but institutional credibility and appropriate relationship between leadership and protection that had preserved systems through methods that required acknowledgement or denial, with consequences that extended far beyond immediate proceedings. The silence that followed Prince Kieran's declaration possessed weight that pressed against every surface in the throne hall, transforming ceremonial space designed for comfortable exercise of authority into arena where truth and political convenience would determine outcomes that extended far beyond individual circumstances to encompass fundamental questions about institutional honesty and a pride acknowledgement of sacrifice that had preserved royal bloodline through methods officially denied. King Aldrich's expression revealed internal struggle as he processed his heir's certainty against framework of official accounts that had shaped his understanding of events during 5 years when administrative convenience had required systematic erasure of uncomfortable truths about dependency and protection that challenged preferred narratives about royal security and appropriate sources of that preserved hereditary authority. "Kieran," he said with parental gentleness that attempted to balance emotional support with royal responsibility for maintaining institutional credibility during proceedings that had developed complications extending beyond simple administrative matter to encompass historical accuracy about events that had been carefully managed through diplomatic revision. "You were 7 years old during the rebellion. Memory can be influenced by trauma in ways that create impressions rather than accurate recollection." The diplomatic language attempted to preserve both his son's dignity and official narratives that had served political stability through methods that required careful management of truth about events whose messy realities had been transformed into acceptable accounts that honored some sacrifice while erasing others, according to administrative convenience and social expectations. But Prince Kieran's response revealed determination that transcended parental concern or institutional preference for qualified statements that preserved flexibility for political considerations, rather than absolute declarations that might commit authority to uncomfortable acknowledgement of dependency that challenged comfortable assumptions about appropriate protection. "I remember everything," he insisted with conviction, that carried across chamber, with clarity that challenged every assumption about childhood recollection and trauma response, his young voice possessing authority that operated beyond ceremonial protocol to honor truth that had been preserved despite official encouragement to accept revised accounts. "I remember her voice singing the lullaby about the silver wolves when I was too scared to be quiet. I remember how she pressed her hand over my mouth when the assassins came close to our hiding place. I remember the blood on her arm where the knife cut her when she pushed me behind the tapestry. The specific details poured forth with precision that challenged comfortable assumptions about memory and political revision. Observations that suggested preservation of truth through personal experience that operated beyond administrative management to honor impact that transcended official documentation or convenient social expectations about appropriate credit for protection. Around the throne hall, assembled nobles exchanged glances that revealed growing comprehension that routine proceedings had developed into confrontation between carefully constructed official accounts and witness testimony that possessed different standards for evaluating worth and historical accuracy about events that had shaped current political arrangements. "The Silver Wolves' Lullaby," whispered Duchess Morena Ravencrest, with recognition that suggested personal knowledge about details that should have been unknown if official accounts about contained rebellion and managed crisis had accurately represented events that occurred during systematic assault on palace security. My grandmother used to sing that song. It's not common knowledge among court musicians or royal entertainers. The observation carried implications that extended beyond simple verification to encompass questions about how someone whose existence had been officially erased might possess intimate knowledge about traditional songs that reflected cultural heritage specific to noble families, whose bloodlines carried such information through generations that preserved authentic, rather than officially sanctioned, versions of historical truth. She knew it because she belonged here. Prince Kieran continued with momentum that indicated his recognition had been building throughout years, when administrative oversight had encouraged forgetting details that might complicate comfortable narratives about heroism and appropriate sources of protection for royal authority. She wore the palace guard uniform. She knew the secret passages. She knew which way the emergency routes led to safety. She wasn't some random person who happened to be present during the attack. She was supposed to protect our family, and she did. The systematic presentation of evidence challenged every assumption about coincidence and chance encounters, revealing pattern of knowledge and preparation that suggested official position and formal responsibility rather than accidental presence during crisis that had been transformed into managed political situation through diplomatic language that honored acceptable sacrifice while erasing in convenient dependency. Isera found herself caught between competing necessities that offered no safe responses. Acknowledgement would confirm details that challenged official narratives designed to serve current political stability, while denial would violate truth that had sustained her through years of systematic erasure and personal trauma that had been shaped by administrative decisions rather than simple individual choice. "Your Majesty," she said with careful diplomacy that attempted to balance honesty with recognition of institutional requirements that governed royal authority through methods that required careful management of truth about events whose acknowledgement might compromise comfortable arrangements about credit and responsibility. Prince Kieran's memory honors events that occurred during circumstances that required individual actions beyond normal protocols. The qualified language attempted to acknowledge his recognition, while avoiding specifics that might commit authority to uncomfortable admission of dependency, that challenged preferred narratives about royal security and appropriate protection that preserved hereditary power through acceptable rather than desperate measures requiring acknowledgement of common sources. "Individual actions," King Aldrich repeated with emphasis that suggested growing comprehension of implications that extended beyond diplomatic evasion to encompass questions about systematic deception that had shaped his understanding of events during period when administrative decisions had apparently prioritized political convenience over truth about sacrifice that had preserved his family. "What individual actions?" He continued with momentum that indicated development toward territory, where comfortable vagueness would prove inadequate for royal inquiry, that demanded specific answers about circumstances that had affected his son's survival during crisis that officially required no such protection from sources beyond acceptable acknowledgement. Before she could formulate response that balanced honesty with discretion necessary for maintaining institutional credibility, Prince Kieran stepped forward, with expression that mixed determination with something approaching defiance of diplomatic considerations that would typically govern acknowledgement of truth during formal proceedings designed to manage, rather than reveal historical accuracy. "She carried me through the burning corridor when the assassins blocked the main escape route," he announced with clarity that challenged every assumption about managed crisis and contained rebellion. Details that suggested systematic assault that had penetrated palace security through methods that exceeded official accounts about limited threat and swift resolution. "She used her body to shield me when they threw the firebombs into the passage where we were hiding," She stayed with me for 3 hours while the fighting continued, even though she was bleeding from multiple wounds that should have required immediate medical attention. The vivid recollection revealed scope of crisis that extended far beyond official narratives about thwarted coup attempt, suggesting systematic siege that had threatened every member of royal family through coordinated assault that had penetrated palace defenses in ways that challenged comfortable assumptions about institutional security and appropriate protection. 3 hours, Duchess Ravencrest observed with growing horror, as implications of extended combat became clear. The official report stated that palace security contained the rebellion within 40 minutes through swift action by loyal guards and minimal casualties among defensive forces. The official reports, Prince Kieran replied with conviction that suggested understanding beyond his years about discrepancies between political necessity and historical accuracy, didn't mention that most of the loyal guards were dead or wounded during the first wave of attack, or that civilian personnel had to provide protection when formal security failed. The casual dismissal of official accounts through first-hand testimony revealed systematic deception that had shaped public understanding of events through methods that required careful management of truth about institutional failure and dependency on sources whose contribution needed to remain invisible for comfort of hierarchies that preferred acknowledgement of acceptable rather than desperate protection. Around the chamber, noble expressions revealed growing comprehension that carefully constructed political narratives were being challenged by witness, whose credibility operated beyond administrative convenience to honor personal experience that possessed different standards for evaluating truth and appropriate recognition of sacrifice that had preserved systems they all depended upon. King Aldric's attention shifted between his son's certainty and woman whose presence had triggered memories that challenged everything he had been told about events that had shaped his family's survival during circumstances that adults had learned to manage through diplomatic revision and selective commemoration that served political stability over historical accuracy. "The blood on your arm," he said directly to Azera, with growing recognition that his heir's testimony carried weight that transcended childhood recollection to encompass verification, that could be observed through physical evidence that had persisted despite administrative preference for erasure and comfortable forgetting. Kieran mentioned a knife wound. "Do you still bear such scar?" The question carried implications that extended beyond simple verification to encompass acknowledgement that would transform administrative hearing into confrontation between official narrative and demonstrable truth that operated beyond political revision to honor impact that had preserved royal bloodline through sacrifice that required recognition or denial, with consequences affecting institutional credibility. Azera found herself faced with choice between continued concealment that had protected both her safety and official narratives, or revelation that would challenge every comfortable assumption about heroism and appropriate acknowledgement while exposing physical evidence that proved dependency. Officials preferred not to acknowledge through methods that served political convenience over truth. "Your Majesty," she replied with steady voice that reflected decision-making processes that had been developing throughout proceedings that challenged her understanding of appropriate responses to authority that had learned to function without acknowledging her existence. "Scars remain as testament to events that official accounts have chosen not to commemorate through methods that honor some sacrifice while erasing others." Without further hesitation, she extended her left arm and pushed back sleeve that revealed raised scar that stretched from wrist to elbow, with pattern that spoke of defensive wounds sustained while protecting someone else from blade intended to cause serious injury or death. Mark that served as personal testament to violence that had been transformed into managed political crisis through diplomat. Icy language. The visible evidence silenced remaining skepticism about Prince Kieran's testimony, while confirming details that challenged every assumption about contained rebellion and swift resolution that had shaped official understanding of events through careful management of truth that served current political arrangements rather than historical accuracy about dependency and sacrifice. "There are others," she continued with momentum that carried her beyond protective concealment into territory where truth would determine outcomes regardless of political convenience, lifting fabric to reveal additional scars that spoke of systematic violence sustained while providing protection, that official accounts had transformed into unnecessary intervention by sources whose contribution wired erasure. Around the throne hall, assembled authority watched with expressions that cycled through shock, recognition, and growing comprehension, that routine administrative matter had exposed systematic deception that challenged fundamental assumptions about institutional honesty and appropriate relationship between leadership and protection, that preserved systems through methods that required acknowledgement or denial. "Guards!" King Aldrich commanded, with voice that carried authority strengthened rather than diminished by revelation that challenged his understanding of events that had shaped his family's survival. "Clear the chamber of all except essential personnel." This proceeding requires privacy that serves truth, rather than political consideration about public perception of institutional credibility. The dismissal of noble observers transformed Throne Hall from ceremonial space designed for comfortable exercise of authority into private arena where truth and political necessity would determine outcomes that affected not just individual circumstances, but fundamental questions about royal debt and appropriate recognition of sacrifice, that had preserved hereditary power through methods that challenged preferred narratives about acceptable sources of strength. As courtiers departed with expressions that mixed disappointment about excluded drama, with relief about avoiding complications that might require uncomfortable acknowledgement of dependency they preferred not to address, the reduced assembly prepared for confrontation between official revision and personal truth that would determine whether comfort or honesty would govern royal response to evidence. That challenged every assumption about appropriate gratitude and legitimate debt. The reckoning that had been delayed through 5 years of systematic erasure was finally beginning, carrying forward momentum that would determine whether institutional authority possessed strength sufficient for acknowledging uncomfortable truths about dependency and sacrifice that had preserved systems through methods that required recognition rather than continued concealment. The throne hall emptied with sounds of retreating footsteps that echoed against marble surfaces designed to amplify authority, leaving behind intimate assembly that included only those whose presence was essential for resolution of truth that had emerged through Prince Kieran's recognition, despite years of systematic administrative oversight that had encouraged comfortable forgetting about events, that challenged official narratives through inconvenient dependency and sacrifice. King Aldrich descended from throne with movements that suggested transformation from ceremonial authority to personal investigation, his approach closing distance that had been maintained through formal positioning, while his expression revealed internal struggle between political necessity and growing comprehension, that his understanding of recent history required fundamental revision, according to evidence that operated beyond diplomatic management. "Izera Ashfall," he said with tone that mixed royal command with something approaching personal inquiry, "you were listed among the casualties from the rebellion. Official records state that your body was recovered from the eastern wing following structural collapse that occurred during the assassin's retreat, when explosive devices destabilized architectural supports throughout that section of the palace." The specific details revealed administrative complexity that had been required to manage her disappearance through methods that provided official explanation while avoiding questions about circumstances that might complicate comfortable narratives about contained crisis and appropriate protection that had preserved royal family through acceptable rather than desperate measures. "Your funeral was conducted with honors appropriate for palace guard, who died in service to the crown," he continued with momentum that indicated growing awareness that official accounts had required systematic construction rather than simple documentation of events as they occurred. "Attended by colleagues who mourned your sacrifice, and family members who received compensation for your loss according to protocols that acknowledged loyal service." The revelation that her death had been officially commemorated while her survival remained carefully concealed exposed institutional deception that extended beyond simple administrative convenience to encompass systematic manipulation of truth that served political stability through methods that required coordination among multiple departments and careful management of evidence that might contradict preferred accounts. "Family members," she repeated with expression that revealed complex emotions as she processed information about consequences that had affected others through administrative decisions designed to serve institutional requirements, rather than individual circumstances or personal preference about recognition and appropriate acknowledgement of continued existence. "Your younger brother accepted death benefits that provided security for your mother's medical care during final illness that occurred 2 years following the rebellion," King Aldrich confirmed with tone that suggested growing comprehension of personal cost that had resulted from administrative decisions about erasure and systematic concealment that had served political objectives through methods that affected innocent individuals. He was told that your sacrifice had preserved royal security, and that compensation reflected appropriate gratitude for service that honored family heritage of loyalty to the crown, through generations that had consistently demonstrated commitment to protection and appropriate duty despite circumstances that challenged individual comfort or preference. The information revealed scope of deception that had extended beyond simple concealment to encompass active construction of alternative reality that provided closure for grieving family while serving administrative requirements that prioritize political convenience over truth about events and their aftermath that continued to affect multiple lives through decisions that had been made without consultation or consent. Prince Kieran watched with expression that revealed growing comprehension of complexity that surrounded events he remembered with clarity that transcended official revision, while his posture suggested determination to honor truth that had sustained him through circumstances that adults had learned to manage through diplomatic language and selective commemoration. "She's not dead," he stated with conviction that challenged every assumption about appropriate management of historical accuracy, his young voice carrying authority that operated beyond ceremonial protocol to honor personal experience that possessed different standards for evaluating worth and legitimate recognition of sacrifice that had preserved his life. "She saved me, and then she disappeared, because someone decided that her survival was inconvenient for the stories they wanted to tell about what happened that night. But she deserves recognition for what she did, not erasure that serves political convenience over truth about protection that preserved our family." The systematic presentation of moral argument challenged administrative logic that had shaped official response to crisis through methods that balanced institutional credibility against individual acknowledgement, while his certainty suggested understanding that transcended age about appropriate relationship between leadership and those who provided protection through sacrifice that required recognition rather than concealment. "Kieran is correct," Isera said with steadiness, that reflected decision-making processes that had been developing throughout proceedings that challenged her understanding of appropriate responses to authority, that possessed power to determine outcomes affecting not just her circumstances, but broader questions about truth and institutional integrity. "My survival was deemed problematic for official accounts that required clear resolution without complications that might arise from witnesses whose testimony possessed different perspective about events that had been transformed into acceptable narrative through diplomatic revision and selective acknowledgement that honored some sacrifice while erasing others." The confession emerged with clarity that honored truth over protective concealment, acknowledging administrative decisions that had shaped her circumstances through methods designed to serve institutional requirements, rather than individual preference about recognition and appropriate credit for protection, that had preserved royal bloodline during crisis, that officially required no such salvatio. "And who made such decision?" King Aldrich asked with authority that demanded specific answers about accountability and responsibility for policies that had affected his family's security, through systematic deception that challenged his understanding of institutional loyalty and appropriate protection of royal interests, through truthful rather than convenient management of historical events. "Chancellor Marcus Greycliffe," she replied without hesitation, naming authority that had possessed administrative power to coordinate systematic erasure through methods that required multiple departments and careful management of evidence that might contradict preferred accounts about contained rebellion and swift resolution. Acting under guidance from advisors who determined that acknowledgement of civilian protection during formal security failure would undermine public confidence in institutional capacity to provide appropriate defense through acceptable methods rather than desperate measures that required dependency on common sources whose contribution challenged comfortable hierarchies. The specific identification revealed political calculation that had prioritized institutional reputation over truth about events, while her analysis suggested understanding of administrative logic that had shaped decisions through methods designed to preserve credibility rather than acknowledge dependency that might compromise authority through admission of failure and reliance on unofficial protection. King Aldrich's expression darkened with rage that had been building throughout revelations that challenged his understanding of loyalty and appropriate service from those whose responsibilities included protection of royal family through methods that honored truth rather than political convenience about events that had shaped current arrangements. "Chancellor Greycliffe," he repeated with tone that carried weight of ultimate authority, preparing to address administrative deception that had affected his family's understanding of recent history, through systematic concealment that violated principles about institutional honesty and appropriate recognition of sacrifice that had preserved hereditary power. He determined that your survival required management through official death, rather than acknowledgement that might complicate preferred narratives about palace security and appropriate protection. He continued with momentum that indicated development toward confrontation with authority that had exceeded proper limits in pursuit of political convenience over truth. Such decision exceeded his administrative power and violated protocols that require royal approval for policies affecting personnel, who provided direct protection to members of ruling family during crisis that threatened institutional survival through coordinated assault that penetrated established defenses. The declaration carried implications that extended beyond simple administrative correction to encompass fundamental questions about accountability and appropriate limits on authority that served royal interests through methods that honored truth rather than institutional convenience about events whose acknowledgement might challenge comfortable assumptions. Furthermore, Prince Kieran interjected with determination that transcended ceremonial deference to honor personal connection that had emerged through shared trauma and protection that had preserved his life during circumstances that adults had learned to manage through diplomatic revision. She should be recognized for her sacrifice rather than punished for survival that someone else decided why. Inconvenient. The moral argument challenged administrative logic with emotional authority that operated beyond political calculation to encompass human principles about appropriate gratitude and legitimate debt that required acknowledgement, rather than continued concealment through methods that served institutional reputation over individual recognition. Recognition, King Aldrich repeated thoughtfully, as he processed implications of evidence that had emerged through proceedings that had developed far beyond administrative matter, to encompass fundamental questions about royal debt and appropriate treatment of those who had provided protection through sacrifice that preserved hereditary authority. What recognition would honor sacrifice that preserved my heir's life during circumstances that required individual courage beyond formal duty? He asked directly, his attention focused entirely on woman whose presence had triggered discoveries that challenged every assumption about recent history and appropriate acknowledgement of dependency that had shaped royal survival. Your Majesty, Isera replied with recognition. That moment had arrived when truth and political necessity would determine outcomes that extended far beyond individual circumstances to encompass institutional integrity and appropriate relationship between leadership and protection. I seek no recognition beyond acknowledgement that my actions served legitimate purpose, rather than requiring conceal me, and through official death that affected others who deserved truth about circumstances and consequences. The qualified response attempted to balance personal dignity with institutional requirements while avoiding demands that might challenge royal authority through inappropriate expectation of specific compensation or advancement that exceeded reasonable acknowledgement of service provided during crisis, that officially required no such protection. But Prince Kieran possessed different understanding of appropriate recognition that operated beyond diplomatic qualification, to honor bonds that had been forged through shared crisis and protection, that transcended formal relationships to encompass personal connection, that required acknowledgement rather than administrative management. She should be my protector, he announced with clarity, that challenged every assumption about appropriate assignment and qualified personnel, his young voice carrying conviction that transcended ceremonial protocol to honor relationship that had been established through circumstances that created obligations beyond normal administrative arrangements. Not some random guard who was appointed because of political connections or family influence, but someone who already proved that she would sacrifice her life to preserve mine, when circumstances required such dedication and courage that exceeded formal duty to encompass personal commitment. The proposal carried weight of emotional logic that challenged administrative procedures with human principles about trust and appropriate selection of personnel whose responsibilities included protection of royal heir, through methods that honored demonstrated capability, rather than political convenience or traditional qualifications that might prove inadequate during crisis. King Aldrich found himself confronting choice between continued administrative convenience that had shaped recent arrangements and acknowledgement that would honor truth while creating precedent about recognition and appropriate treatment of those whose sacrifice had preserved royal family through methods that challenged comfortable assumptions about institutional security and legitimate sources of strength. The decision would determine not just individual outcomes, but fundamental questions about institutional integrity and appropriate relationship between leadership and protection that served hereditary authority through honest, rather than convenient management of dependency and debt, that required acknowledgement or continued concealment with consequences affecting credibility that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances. Around them, Throne Hall waited in silence that pressed against surfaces designed to amplify authority, while architectural grandeur served as backdrop for confrontation between truth and political necessity that would determine whether comfort or honesty would govern royal response to evidence that challenged every assumption about appropriate gratitude and legitimate recognition of sacrifice. That had preserved systems through desperate rather than acceptable measures. The reckoning that had been delayed through years of systematic erasure was reaching culmination that would test whether institutional authority possessed strength sufficient for acknowledging uncomfortable truths about dependency, while honoring obligations that transcended political convenience to serve justice that operated beyond administrative management to encompass human principles about appropriate treatment of those who had given everything to preserve what others took for granted. 2 years later, the Royal Protection Ceremony had become annual celebration that honored service and sacrifice throughout territories where security depended on recognition rather than erasure, acknowledgement rather than convenient forgetting that had previously characterized official responses to protection that challenged comfortable narratives about institutional strength and appropriate sourcing. Of royal security through acceptable rather than desperate measures that required uncomfortable dependency. Commander Isera Ashfall stood beside Prince Kieran in gardens that had been designed to provide sanctuary within palace grounds, her position reflecting transformation from systematic erasure to formal recognition that honored demonstrated capability, while establishing precedent about appropriate treatment of those whose sacrifice preserved royal bloodline through methods that transcended politic. All convenience to serve justice and truth. The ceremony itself attracted representatives from allied kingdoms who had learned about institutional reforms that balanced security requirements with honest acknowledgement of dependency, while their presence suggested growing acceptance of policies that honored individual contribution, rather than maintaining hierarchies that reduced protection to abstract concepts, divorced from personal sacrifice. And human cost. The Guard Reformation has been implemented throughout the Eastern Territories, she reported to King Aldrich with satisfaction, that reflected systematic changes that had emerged from confrontation between truth and political convenience. Policies that prioritized capability over bloodline while establishing standards that honored service through recognition, rather than erasure when outcomes challenged. NGED preferred narratives. Selection processes now emphasize demonstrated loyalty and proven capability under pressure, rather than political connections or family influence that previously determined assignments according to social expectations, rather than practical requirements for protection that served royal security through effective rather than ceremonial methods. The comprehensive approach had transformed palace security from system based on traditional qualifications to organization that honored merit while maintaining appropriate standards for personnel whose responsibilities included protection of royal family through methods that balanced effectiveness with institutional dignity and appropriate recognition of contribution. Prince Kieran, now 14 and carrying himself with confidence that reflected security born from genuine protection rather than ceremonial display, participated actively in discussions about policies that would govern his future reign, according to principles that honored truth over convenience, while maintaining royal authority through methods that acknowledged dependency rather than denying connections that preserved hereditary power. The memorial wall has been completed, he observed with satisfaction, that spoke of personal investment in recognition that honored sacrifice that had been systematically erased, while his tone carried authority that transcended age to encompass understanding about appropriate leadership and institutional integrity that served justice rather than political convenience. Every guard who died during the rebellion has been acknowledged by name, including those whose contribution was previously concealed through administrative decisions that prioritized political narrative over truth, about events that shaped our family's survival through individual courage that exceeded formal duty. The memorial represented visible acknowledgement of institutional debt, while providing permanent record that challenged comfortable assumptions about contained crisis and managed political situation, serving educational function about actual cost of security that had been hidden through diplomatic language and selective commemoration that honored acceptable sacrifice while erasing inconvenient dependency. The investigation into Chancellor Greycliffe's administrative overreach has been concluded, King Aldrich announced with tone that carried weight of royal justice applied to authority that had exceeded proper limits through systematic deception that affected royal family's understanding of recent history, while violating principles about institutional honesty and appropriate recognition of sacrifice. His position has been terminated, and policies have been implemented that prevent future concealment of information that affects royal security through methods that require honest reporting rather than convenient revision that serves political stability over truth about events and their consequences. The administrative reforms had established oversight that prevented individual officials from managing historical accuracy according to personal judgment about political convenience, while new protocols required transparency that honored institutional integrity over comfortable narratives that might conceal uncomfortable dependencies or inappropriate methods that preserved authority through quasi-tenable means. Throughout the territories, communities had learned about transformation that honored recognition over erasure, truth over political convenience, while their response suggested growing acceptance of leadership that acknowledged dependency rather than maintaining fiction about institutional independence that required no assistance from sources whose contribution challenged hierarchical assumptions about appropriate protection and legitimate strength. The response from allied kingdoms has been universally positive. Commander Ashfall continued with professional satisfaction that reflected broader implications of policies that had emerged from individual confrontation with systematic deception, particularly regarding protocols that balance security requirements with honest acknowledgement of sacrifice that preserves institutions through method, is that honor human cost, rather than abstracting protection into concepts divorced from personal consequences. Several territories have requested guidance about implementing similar reforms that prioritize capability over political connections while establishing recognition that honors service through acknowledgement rather than concealment when outcomes challenge preferred narratives about institutional strength and appropriate sources of royal security. The diplomatic success suggested that honesty about dependency and sacrifice served political objectives more effectively than concealment that required systematic deception, while international recognition provided validation for approaches that balanced security requirements with ethical principles about appropriate treatment of those whose contribution preserved systems through personal risk and demonstrated loyalty. As evening settled over palace grounds that had been transformed from spaces haunted by concealment into gardens that honored memory and recognition, Prince Kieran approached woman whose courage had preserved his life while teaching lessons about authentic authority that would shape his understanding of appropriate leadership throughout future reign. "Commander," he said with formality that honored professional relationship, while his tone carried personal warmth that reflected bond forged through shared trauma and protection that had transcended ceremonial duty to encompass genuine connection based on demonstrated character rather than inherited status. "Thank you for teaching me that true strength acknowledges those who make it possible." "Your Highness," she replied with dignity that had been restored through recognition, while her expression revealed satisfaction that came from service that honored principles rather than requiring compromise of essential character. Strength that requires concealment of its sources was never genuine strength at all, but political convenience disguised as institutional capability. Their conversation carried implications that extended beyond personal relationship to encompass fundamental questions about leadership and appropriate exercise of authority that served protection rather than demanding submission through fear or concealment of dependency that might challenge comfortable assumptions about hereditary power and legitimate governance. Around them, palace staff moved through evening routines with efficiency that reflected security born from honest assessment rather than ceremonial display, while their confidence suggested understanding that protection operated through demonstrated capability rather than traditional assumptions about acceptable sources of strength and appropriate methods for preserving royal authority. "The education reforms are showing remarkable results," King Aldrich observed as he joined conversation that had been developing throughout years when individual transformation had inspired institutional changes that honored truth over convenience while maintaining appropriate standards for royal security and territorial governance, particularly regarding curricula that teach accurate history rate, than convenient revision that serves political stability over educational integrity. Young people throughout the territories are learning about authentic leadership that acknowledges dependency, rather than maintaining fiction about institutional independence, while their responses suggest growing acceptance of authority that honors sacrifice rather than demanding submission through systematic concealment of uncomfortable truths about protection and human cost. The educational transformation had established foundations for future leadership that would honor recognition over erasure, truth over political convenience, while providing next generation with understanding about appropriate relationship between authority and those who preserved systems through personal sacrifice that required acknowledgement rather than continued concealment. In royal archives where their reforms would be preserved for future study, scholars would document methods that had balanced security requirements with honest acknowledgement of dependency, learning that institutional strength required recognition of sources rather than concealment that served temporary comfort over long-term credibility and appropriate relationship between leadership and protect it. But in private moments when duty allowed expression of personal connection that had emerged through shared trauma and mutual respect, they remembered Throne Hall, where young voice had spoken truth that challenged every assumption about appropriate recognition and institutional integrity, moment when courage had revealed character that transcended hierarchy to honor human principles about justice and legitimate debt. The Omega, who had learned to disappear, had discovered that recognition operated beyond political convenience when truth possessed advocates willing to challenge comfortable narratives, while the Prince, who had preserved memory despite official encouragement to forget, had learned that authentic authority acknowledged rather than concealed the sources of its strength and security. Their story had begun with sacrifice that was systematically erased, continued through recognition that challenged institutional deception, and culminated in transformation that honored truth over political convenience while establishing precedent about appropriate treatment of those whose contribution preserved systems through methods that required acknowledgement rather than concealment. The palace walls that had witnessed both sacrifice and systematic erasure now served as backdrop for recognition that honored individual courage, while inspiring institutional reforms that balanced security requirements with ethical principles about honest acknowledgement of dependency and appropriate gratitude for protection that preserved royal authority through human cost that deserved commemoration rather than concealment. Some debts could not be eliminated through administrative convenience, requiring recognition that operated beyond political calculation to honor justice that served truth rather than comfortable narratives about institutional independence and appropriate sources of strength that preserved hereditary power through methods that challenged assumptions about legitimate governance and authentic leadership. The reckoning had been delayed but never avoided, carrying forward through years of systematic concealment until moment when young voice spoke certainties that adults had learned to manage through diplomatic language, proving that truth possessed persistence that exceeded political convenience to serve recognition that honored sacrifice over administrative comfort and individual courage over institutional reputation. In palace gardens where memorial wall provided permanent acknowledgement of sacrifice that had been systematically erased, future generations would learn that strength required honest recognition of its sources, that authority served justice through acknowledgement rather than concealment, and that sometimes the most profound transformations began with smallest voice speaking truth that challenged every comfortable assumption about power and its appropriate relationship to those who preserved it through sacrifice that transcended formal duty to encompass personal commitment that demanded recognition rather than erasure. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.